Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very accomplished entrepreneur, currently in Poland, but from the US, Grant Blaisdell. Grant, welcome to the show.
Hello, Ashutosh, and thanks for having me once again.
Thank you. Grant is the co-founder of Copernic Space and Coinfirm. He's a partner of bigidea.eu, and he's president of the Lady Rocket Foundation. So, Grant, you say you're the third generation in your family interested in space. Tell me a little more.
I would say beyond interested. So the whole story behind Copernic Space starts with my grandfather. Built astronaut, the space program out here in Poland in the 60s and 70s. And he had these early writings and works as well around this idea of democratizing or opening up the space economy or the space market to the wider commercial and global market. So my mother's carried that torch. She's also my co-founder with me in Copernic Space. And if aerospace was a thing, you could say 4 generations, because my great-grandfather helped fund the first airline in Poland. Actually, it might be the oldest airline in Europe, which is LOT.
Wow. So your great-grandfather was the founder of LOT?
I wouldn't say founder. He was one of the people who helped finance it because it was a state initiative.
Oh, wow. Incredible. So let's come to Copernic Space, Grant. Tell me a little bit about this venture and what was your motivation behind it?
Well, you just got one of the motivations behind it, which is, a 3-generation legacy focused on that idea of, okay, well, how do we take something that is, a lot of people don't realize how important the space market has been for decades in their life and the things that they use in their daily basis. So that's one of the origins of the goal. The other one is my mother longer, but me for around 10 years now, a decade. Have involved in the space economy in various ways through the Lady Rocket Foundation, especially focus around what is now Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. That, okay, well, and I'll get into my experience a little bit more as to why we have this sort of approach. But we realized, okay, well, this is going to be probably the largest, most valuable, and not just economically valuable, but as far as solutions it can provide, to life on Earth. It's going to be one of the largest, most valuable markets in mankind's history. But these ventures and the commercial market have never had a marketplace or really the business models and technological capabilities behind them to enable the space market and the commercial and even the average person, the general public, to interact, whether that's through investment or whether that's through acquisition of what we call space assets. So ownership and access, whether it's payload or satellite imagery. So things with utility, right? How do we use what space is actually creating? And we realize that that's one of the most important opportunities that exist for the next decades and decades and decades is who's going to build the economic infrastructure for the new space economy.
Fascinating. And for my viewers and listeners, can you help us to understand what are some of the financial opportunities from space that the average human being can take advantage of?
Well, we view the market in 2 sides. That's why us as a platform, which is built on Web3 technologies, we have 2 main applications. We have a side one that's already launched called Spaceables, which is the largest Web3 based market for space art, any creations, music, digital fashion. And that's how we kind of onboard, let's say, more of the creative community into the space economy. But our 2 main applications are called SpaceSmart and SpacePool. SpaceSmart is the marketplace for space. So we enable the commercial and even the retail market not only to be able to acquire and access and utilize space assets like payload, right? But in a lot of cases to create their own space assets out of them that they can further commercialize on the market. Because if I'm someone, for example, SpaceX's main business model is payload. They are paid to send other people's things into space.
Correct.
But to us, there's the initial acquisition point of the rights, access, ownership of that physical space to put your things in it, right? That's the initial transaction. That's billions of dollars if you can streamline and scale up those sort of transactions. But the big value in our head is, okay, well, I'm putting something in that payload now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I'm actually creating a new space asset out of this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And using blockchain technology, not only can we streamline and connect that first transaction with trust, but create a new asset that's directly tied. It shows the original asset that it's part of this payload that can then be further commercialized in some manners on our marketplace. So that's one. We have artists, we have brands that are looking to send their assets into space, whether physically or digitally, and create their own space assets that they can commercialize on the commercial market further. So that's one way.
Yeah. So let me just dig a little deeper on this one. You know, SpaceX is carrying payload up into space.
Correct.
When you step in, are you saying that you will lease some space on SpaceX or send up your own payload, which will then be able to carry some other assets of other people? How will that work?
The genius a little bit of our platform is we're non-intermediary around assets, funds, data. We only control the entry point. So quality of assets and verifying users, right? Because like an American space company, for example, can't sell to Chinese nationals.
Correct.
Right? Either primary or secondary market. So you have to have those sort of controls. But kind of the genius of our model is we're providing the infrastructure that enables these space ventures to digitize, in this case, tokenize their assets, attach those utilities, do something which is really cool around blockchain tech as well, which is fractionalize those assets, which enables a wider part of the commercial market to afford them, access them, et cetera, and offer that on a marketplace. So we are actually not in the business of launching anything.
Okay.
We might have some rare cases where we do projects where we buy our own payload and we do our own things with it, but that's not our core business model. Our core business model is how do we connect these 2 points and provide them a platform that provides functionality both economically as well as utility around it.
Fascinating. You also said that Copernic Space makes real space assets such as satellite imagery or fractional ownership of space cargo accessible and easy to acquire for millions around the world. Help me understand how this would work, especially when you said that you are basically at two ends of the spectrum.
Right. So as a marketplace, we host both sellers and buyers, right? That's what we need to bring to the table and is one of our values around this. So I'm very use case driven. So we can take a look, we kind of spoke a little bit about payload and cargo. Right. So we've done already commercial proof of concepts around payloads. So just imagine it this way is, there's 1 ton of payload commercially available on this flight, right? That entity enters Copernic Space. They go through just verification process with us. So we know that they legitimately can offer this commercially. They tokenize that 1 ton, right? So you have an asset created now that represents 1 ton of physical payload, and they attach whatever rights, utilities, access, terms attached with that. They list that on a marketplace and people come in and that entity set a minimum. Let's say the minimum's 10 kilos. That's the minimum payload you can buy. So let's say someone picks 12 kilos. Okay. They go through the process with the entity. They share the agreements. This happens all through the platform. And the moment it's done, the space company confirms it. The transaction can happen on blockchain or off blockchain. We provide those capabilities. If it's on blockchain, it automatically hits a smart contract that creates that new asset, right? So it actually tears off that 12 kilos off that 1 ton supply, mints a new asset that represents that asset from the buyer, right? And now they have verified access, ownership, rights, et cetera, to those 12 kilos. And they can submit their asset and transform it to represent that new asset that they submitted on the payload, right? And then they can further do the same thing with it commercially, right? They could fractionalize it and sell it further, saying, hey, you have partial ownership of our payload with these utilities, right? Eventually we'll get into data, right? Because these payloads are going to be generating data and those sort of things. So that's like kind of how payload will work. We really love satellite imagery. For example, we think that's going to just absolutely change how things
Absolutely.
Work on Earth if you really streamline, scale, and democratize that access to it. So think of it in the same way, except the supply isn't volume, right? It's not kilograms, or in the case of digital payload, megabytes, kilobytes, etc. Right? And what they'll be buying is, for example, time on a satellite for its capacity power, or they'll be buying a license for X amount of images or monthly access to query images, right? And once again, it mints, they create this asset out of it, and they'll buy, let's say, a license to 10, right? And it creates this new asset, which represents a license. And the beautiful thing that NFTs do and Web3 tech does is we not only treat that as a license, but you can access directly the API, so the terminal to start querying these images under that license through our platform, through an NFT direct. We're non-intermediate around that. And anybody who's in space data and tech understand how important that kind of peer-to-peer aspect is. You don't want intermediary players around this stuff. So if we're able, and we're working with some great satellite players around that too, if we enable, like we have initiative Satellite Rhino, it's a partnership and initiative with the premier organization in South Africa fighting animal poaching of endangered rhinos. You're Indian, you know, there's lots of similar sort of initiatives and things like that in India. So if we enable, in this case, saving the survivors to be able to twice a day get an image over a set area of land, which are big areas of land that a lot of these entities are manually patrolling, etc. If we give them 2 images a day through a license that they can access easily through a interface like this, right? You know, scale that up across the world, it can create a lot of positive impact, you know, on life. So those are kind of our goals as far as this marketplace over the next year and a half, is to launch a bunch of commercial sales, both in payloads as well as satellite imagery, and set standards for this market, right? Because that's another issue with this market, is everything's kind of chopped up. There's no streamlined standards. So we think it's incredibly valuable, once again, to just create that initial, you know, transaction. But obviously the capability to create your own space assets and these things is going to introduce a whole new revenue stream.
Well said. And you're so right. I mean, satellite imagery will be very, very large. And when you start to use or look at uses or use cases, which go, you know, even to support private drones, you know, or even a lot of the transportation or delivery. I think a lot of that
logistics will be huge. Logistics will be huge. We had a bunch of interesting cases from emerging markets. One is real estate, right? So how do you survey a large area, mining rights, which is going to be interesting on the moon as well. But environmental things are huge also.
Correct. Well said. You also speak about, and you just mentioned a little bit about it, about the Web3 marketplace. Web3 also leads us into the metaverse.
Sure, it doesn't have to, but it can. Like Web3 is the economic foundation of the metaverse.
No, I'm with you, but I was just linking it because there are people who've been talking about how you can actually build have a conference sitting in a restaurant on Mars. In the metaverse. Now, does that also come into your use case at all?
Yeah, it's not a core business. You can even find some articles about some of our metaverse partnerships talking about us integrating these real space assets into the metaverse. There's companies that are dedicated to just building out space simulations and experiences in VR and the metaverse. Right? With us, we're approaching it a little bit kind of more consumery in the beginning. So what you're going to see from us in the beginning, whether it's in Decentraland or these newer kind of metaverses coming out, we're working on some partnerships with them. You'll either be running into experiences. Well, for example, you'll run into a rover in some sort of event or experience, and you'll be able to actually, you know, buy fractional ownership or access or utilities to these real assets while you're going through the metaverse. Another partner of ours is dedicated to building an entire like spaceport complex, and we'll be taking our partners, the users on our marketplace, and integrating their assets into various rooms, galleries, etc. With that ecosystem. So I think with the metaverse, is before it gets really mass consumer and these kind of experiences where people just want to be there kind of good portions of the day, kind of like video gaming is entered into the daily lives of a lot of people. I think it's going to have a lot of dedicated commercial enterprise. That's why you see also, I think, Microsoft and now Facebook going a lot into like the teleconferencing sort of aspects around it. So you're going to have that with space experiences, but I know a lot of players are really trying to take that to like as real of a level as possible. And I know the US government is even investing, I think, in some VR metaverse simulations for space training.
Fascinating. There is also another thing I want to talk about, that under a UN charter, no nation owns any of the planetary bodies, including the moon. What kind of opportunities do you see coming up with more and more commercialization of space for private sector?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about the moon and property rights, or however we want to call them specifically, so one of our advisors and someone I work closely with is Kevin O'Connell. So he's the former director of space commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce. He's someone who's been really pushing kind of this privatization and let's set the standards for the commercial market within government. He's been pushing that for decades. And he thinks the moon itself in the next decade or so is going to be near $1 trillion economy, right? And as to owning of the property rights and the legalities, etc., there's kind of ways around it. I'm not the biggest specialist in that. We have some partners and friends that are, so I don't want to go too far into it. Like there's someone called Simon Drake, for example. He's a friend of ours with Lunar Registry. He's just focused on, okay, how do we start commercially defining ownership rights around that? So there's people that are smarter than I am at this particular thing.
No, I know. And I'm interesting that you spoke about the Lunar Registry, because about 30 years ago, I bought 1,772 hectares of land through the Lunar Registry for whatever it's worth. But
I think this is a different, project or entity we're speaking about. So as to what you purchased, you didn't purchase anything.
I know.
Right? Because it's an important nuance people need to understand, because it's like, so owning the actual moon is very different than owning something on the moon.
Correct.
So what you're going to see is the private industry starting to create infrastructure and placing things on the moon, and they have ownership of that. That doesn't mean they have necessarily ownership of what's underneath it. But then there's people, like I said, who are working on, okay, well, how do we get into moon mining rights? How do we get into these things? Because one of the big values people need to understand behind our platform is the government and the VCs aren't going to be the ones who eventually buy and fund the majority of space. There's not enough capital and high risk capital in those two avenues. And like governments, yes, there's more governments coming out dedicating money to space. But generally, like NASA's the biggest funder. It's generally the same piece of cheese or a shrinking piece of cheese with more entities chasing that piece of cheese, right? So a lot of the smarter companies know that they have to take their viewpoint from 90% government funds, which is, I think, generally what's happening, and flip that over to the commercial market. And the commercial market wants to get into space. It's just they don't know where to go. There's no marketplace for space, right? They don't even know where to start most of the time, right? It's a very privileged and exclusive thing, whether you're talking about investment or buying assets. And we haven't even started talking about the investment side,
Very interesting. Two more questions for you. Space has traditionally been the preserve of only governments. Do you see, the US government, for example, is definitely privatizing with organizations like SpaceX now getting opportunities. But do you see other governments also beginning to open up?
Yeah, a lot of other governments have to because they just don't have they just can't catch up to the infrastructure and everything that's been done.
Mm.
The ESA is has been more and more ambitious around supporting startups, for example.
Mm.
In Dubai and that area, you even have two dedicated spaceport agency sort of entities.
Mm.
And to those, for us, once again, we view ourselves as like an economic operating system. We
Mm.
just have marketplaces on top.
Yeah.
So, we see a day where major government like NASA will be using our platform. That doesn't necessarily they're making all these things public, but they're using our platform for their own little market and partners, or for their own missions and assets. But for us, I think we provide great value to those smaller, newer, emerging uh, government space agencies so that they have a market to easily access, finance their own sort of space missions and
Mm.
assets as well, right? Like, can this government find a payload that is suitable for them, very easily buy it, do that, and then
Mm.
maybe interact with their general public, give the public back some
Mm.
ownership or some access or some utility in space. There's a whole different model we're helping create here that really engages, the wider market. So, yeah, it's fascinating. They're putting a lot more money in. The UK put £2 billion in, I believe, the other month just into space. So
Mm.
it's happening, but the US is still by far,
And you're right. I mean, India just had their first private launch 2 weeks ago, where they took up, small satellites.
I think the Indian market will be huge,
It will.
depending on how much the government puts into it and also how much the government gets in the way of entrepreneurs, which
Correct.
is a good thing,
Correct.
governments are good at.
Correct. And my last question to you, and this is from a different perspective, space also presents the maximum amount of military challenges. And every country is now gearing up to have their own space force. The US has already got a space force. What do you see as the military challenge to privatization of or commercialization of space?
Uh, I think so. Two sides of that. We talked about the lunar rights and things like that. So I don't know. I don't think you can call them geopolitical battles, but let's use
Mhm.
that term.
Absolutely.
Uh, So over the next decades, that's going to be one of the biggest geopolitical battles you're going to see, especially between U.S. and China.
Mm.
And it's funny. It relates to like natural resources on Earth and some of the geopolitical battles that are happening here.
Right.
Like owners of some of these places and related materials are access to materials that are very rare, that are in
Mm.
our phone,
Yeah.
right? So I think you're going to see a big rush towards that, and it's going to get uncomfortable at times, especially on the
Mm.
moon, I think, here in the near future. But people have to remember that a lot of space applications are originally military
Mhm.
applications, right? So even with what the US did recently with its microchip sort of sanctions towards China, that's going to have a huge effect
Mm.
on how China actually accesses certain things in space, at least
Absolutely.
temporarily.
Yeah.
So I think space people don't understand how much space is at the core of, once again, the most important, ironically, the most important market on Earth is going to be space, and that's also going to come into geopolitics and
Correct.
those sort of.
Correct. And it's also the only unexplored frontier for mankind. So you're absolutely
Well, last point to that,
right.
why you see so many companies and brands, et cetera, really going in the metaverse. They're all trying to run into the metaverse.
Mm.
It's because most things on Earth have generally been done, recycled, et cetera. There's only
Mm.
two places you can really go to do anything that's totally new and claim new
Mm.
land, et cetera. And that's the metaverse, which has low barriers to entry, generally speaking,
Mm. Mm.
and space, which has extremely high barriers of entry.
Right. Well
Right.
said.
So our thing is how do we break down those barriers to entry so that it's not only a couple billionaires and governments and these 10,000 private companies that already exist have
Mm.
some entry point, to the commercial market.
Very interesting. And on that note, Grant, thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for talking to me about your family and their interest in space. Amazing 4 generations of passionate family members in the area of space. Thank you for talking to me about Copernic Space and all the incredible work you're doing. Thank you also for talking to me about so many different applications and the opportunities that the space presents to humanity. Thank you.
There's not enough time for space, So thank you, Ashutosh. Happy to do a follow-up and dive deeper next time.
I look forward to that. Thank you again.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.